The pewter goblets caught the firelight like captured stars, each one filled with whiskey that would be the last thing some guests ever tasted. In the great hall of Copperfield Ranch, 180 voices rose in celebration, unaware that their trusted house servant had already sealed their fate with a smile and a silver ladle. This isn't just another tale of frontier violence or Western justice. It's the story of how one man turned a wedding celebration into a calculated strike against an entire family dynasty. The evening of August 12, 1852, found Arizona Territory's most powerful cattle barons at their most vulnerable, gathered to celebrate the union that would merge two empires into an unstoppable force. But Samuel had spent 15 years watching, learning, and planning. He knew their habits, their cruelties, their casual disregard for human dignity. Most importantly, he knew their recipe for the family's celebrated wedding stew, a frontier delicacy that required specific spices capable of masking other, deadlier flavors entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flames from 100 oil lamps danced across the rough-hewn walls of Copperfield Ranch's great hall, casting shadows that seemed to writhe like serpents across the faces of Arizona Territory's most powerful cattle barons. Tonight, those shadows would prove prophetic. The long oak tables, hewn from trees that had traveled 1,000 miles by wagon train, groaned under the weight of a feast that would mark both celebration and catastrophe. Crystal decanters filled with imported whiskey reflected the lamplight like liquid amber, each vessel containing spirits that would soon carry more than alcohol to the lips of the territory's elite. Samuel moved through this scene of frontier opulence like smoke through stone, his weathered hands steady as he carried platters of roasted beef and cornbread that still steamed from the kitchen ovens. At 42, his face bore the deep lines that came from decades under the Arizona sun, but his dark eyes held an intelligence that the assembled guests had long since learned to overlook. They saw only what they needed to see. The reliable house servant who had managed their domestic comfort for 15 years, invisible until required, forgotten the moment his services were complete. But tonight was different. Tonight, Samuel carried more than food and drink across the polished floors of Copperfield's main hall. He carried justice, measured out in precise doses, and disguised with the same meticulous care he had learned to apply to every aspect of serving the family that owned him. The wedding feast of Arendor Valcrest to Morel Corvain would unite two of the territory's most influential ranching dynasties, combining nearly 800,000 acres of prime grazing land and the political power that came with controlling water rights across 3 counties. The guests had traveled from across the Southwest to witness this alliance. Territorial officials sat beside Mexican land grant holders who had managed to retain their property despite the changing flags and laws. Cattle buyers from as far east as Kansas rubbed shoulders with mine owners, whose silver had funded the expansion of civilization into this harsh landscape. Apache scouts who had traded their traditional ways for steady wages served as guides and guards for men who measured their wealth in livestock rather than gold. The bride herself commanded attention from her position at the head table, draped in silk that had crossed an ocean and a continent to reach this remote corner of the American frontier. Morel Corvain's beauty was legendary throughout the territory, but Samuel knew the cruelty that lived behind those carefully painted features. He had witnessed her casual violence toward the Mexican workers who maintained her family's orchards, had seen her laugh when servants were whipped for infractions as minor as spilling wine or speaking too loudly in her presence. Arendor Valcrest, the groom, represented everything that was ambitious and ruthless about the territory's emerging elite. At 28, he had already consolidated control over vast stretches of grazing land through a combination of legal maneuvering, political connections, and carefully orchestrated violence against smaller ranchers who refused to sell. His smile tonight was that of a man who had achieved everything he had ever desired, unaware that his moment of triumph would become his final hour. The wedding feast itself was a testament to the wealth and power that frontier success could generate. Beef had been slow-roasted in pits dug specifically for this occasion, seasoned with spices that had traveled the Santa Fe Trail and chile peppers grown in the irrigated fields along the Salt River. Cornbread made with flour ground from wheat cultivated in the territory's few agricultural valleys accompanied beans seasoned with herbs that had been carefully cultivated in the ranch's protected garden. Wine from California's emerging vineyards, mixed with whiskey distilled in Kentucky, and rum that had originated in Caribbean sugar plantations. But the centerpiece of the evening's feast was the wedding stew, a recipe that had been passed down through generations of frontier families who had learned to create comfort and celebration from whatever provisions the harsh landscape could provide. The recipe required a precise combination of beef, game meat, vegetables, and spices that had been gathered from across the territory's trading networks. The complexity of flavors was designed to showcase both the wealth of the hosts and their connection to the broader world of commerce that was transforming the American West. Samuel had learned this recipe during his early years of service to the Valcrest family, memorizing not just the ingredients, but the exact timing and techniques required to achieve the perfect balance of flavors. He understood how the slow cooking process would meld the various components into a unified whole, and more importantly, he knew how the complex mixture of spices and seasonings could mask other flavors entirely. The Great Hall itself reflected the strange mixture of frontier pragmatism and Eastern sophistication that characterized the territory's emerging elite. Walls constructed from local pine were adorned with paintings that had been transported across the continent in carefully padded wagon beds. Furniture crafted by Mexican artisans using traditional techniques sat beside pieces that had been shipped from furniture makers in St. Louis and New York. The floor, made from planks hewn from trees that had grown along mountain streams, was covered with rugs that had been woven by Navajo craftsmen using patterns that predated European arrival by centuries. Outside the Great Hall, the August night carried the sounds of celebration that extended far beyond the main house. Mexican vaqueros, who worked the vast herds, sang traditional songs around fires that dotted the landscape like scattered stars. Apache guides shared stories and traded jokes in their own language, while they maintained watch for the threats that still haunted the territory's remote regions. The celebration encompassed the entire complex community that had grown around the success of the territory's cattle industry. But inside the hall, the focus remained on the feast that would cement the alliance between two families whose power extended far beyond their immediate holdings. The marriage would create a ranching empire that could influence territorial politics, control access to water rights, and determine the fate of smaller ranchers throughout the region. The guests understood that they were witnessing the birth of a dynasty that could shape the territory's transition from frontier outpost to eventual statehood. Samuel understood this as well, which was why his careful preparations over the previous weeks had focused not just on the wedding feast itself, but on ensuring that this dynasty would end before it could fully begin. As he watched the guests raise their glasses in toast to the future, he felt neither satisfaction nor revenge, only the quiet certainty that justice would finally be served alongside the evening's meal. The clock on the wall, imported from a Massachusetts clockmaker and transported across the continent with the same care afforded to fine china, ticked away the final minutes of an era. Soon the great hall would fall silent except for sounds that no celebration should contain, and Samuel would watch as the bloodline that had caused so much suffering finally reached its end. The Arizona Territory of 1852 existed in a state of controlled chaos, where Mexican land grants met American ambition under a blazing sun that seemed to burn away all pretense of civilized law. Copperfield Ranch sprawled across 400,000 acres of this disputed landscape, a domain carved from territory that had changed flags 3 times in living memory, and still bore the scars of Apache raids, Mexican resistance, and American expansion. The wedding celebration taking place in its great hall represented more than the union of 2 families. It was a consolidation of power that would determine who controlled the water, land, and political influence necessary for survival in this harsh frontier. The cattle industry had transformed the territory from a collection of scattered settlements into a complex economic system that reached from the Colorado River to the trading posts along the Rio Grande. Ranchers like the Valcrest and Corvain families had built their empires by understanding that success required more than simply running cattle on open range. They needed to control water sources, maintain relationships with territorial officials, negotiate treaties with Apache leaders, and establish trading relationships that connected their remote holdings to markets in California, Texas, and beyond. Arendor Valcrest's father, Therick Valcrest, had established the family's fortune through a combination of shrewd business practices and carefully orchestrated violence that had eliminated competitors and consolidated control over vast stretches of grazing land. The elder Valacrest had arrived in the territory as a young man, with little more than a wagon, a few head of cattle, and an understanding of how to read the landscape for water sources and defensible positions. Over 3 decades, he had built an empire that employed over 200 workers and controlled resources that made him one of the most influential men in the territory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Corvain family had achieved similar success through different methods, focusing on agricultural development and political connections rather than pure expansion of grazing rights. Morel's father, Gavril Corvain, had established orchards and cultivated crops that supplied the territory's growing population of miners, soldiers, and settlers. His holdings included not just agricultural land but also trading posts, supply depots, and transportation networks that connected remote settlements to broader markets. The alliance between the Valcrest and Corvain families would create a vertically integrated operation that controlled everything from cattle production to food distribution throughout the territory. The social hierarchy that governed frontier society was both more fluid and more rigid than the established systems of the eastern states. Wealth and success could elevate a man from poverty to influence within a few years, but the color of his skin, his country of origin, and his relationship to the institution of slavery determined the limits of his advancement. Mexican landowners who had retained their property under American rule occupied an ambiguous position, respected for their wealth but viewed with suspicion due to their cultural and religious differences from the American settlers. Apache peoples maintained an even more complex relationship with the emerging territorial society. Some had negotiated treaties that allowed them to serve as guides, scouts, and workers for the ranching operations that were transforming their traditional lands. Others continued to resist American expansion through raids and warfare that kept the entire territory in a state of constant tension. The successful ranchers had learned to navigate these relationships through a combination of diplomatic agreements, military alliances, and strategic violence that maintained their dominance, while avoiding the kind of warfare that could destroy their economic operations entirely. The institution of slavery in the Arizona Territory existed in a legal gray area that reflected the complex political compromises surrounding territorial expansion. While the territory had not been formally organized as either slave or free, the reality was that wealthy families like the Valcrest and Corvain dynasties maintained enslaved workers who had been brought west from Texas, Arkansas, and other slave states. These workers performed the domestic labor, skilled crafts, and agricultural work that made the ranching operations possible, but their legal status remained uncertain due to the ongoing national debates about slavery's expansion into new territories. Samuel's position within this system reflected the contradictions that characterized frontier slavery. As a house servant who had been with the Valcrest family for 15 years, he possessed skills, knowledge, and responsibilities that made him valuable beyond simple manual labor. He could read and write, manage complex household operations, and negotiate with suppliers and workers in multiple languages. Yet his legal status remained that of property, subject to sale, punishment, or worse at the whim of his owners. The wedding celebration itself served multiple functions beyond the obvious religious and social purposes. It was a political gathering where territorial officials, military commanders, and business leaders could conduct informal negotiations about land rights, water access, and political appointments. It was an economic summit where trading relationships were established and business deals were finalized. It was a social display where families demonstrated their wealth, connections, and cultural sophistication to peers and competitors. The guest list reflected the complex web of relationships that governed territorial society. Territorial Governor Malvin Carraith attended alongside military commanders who were responsible for maintaining peace with Apache peoples. Mexican landowners like Don Lorick Venrith shared tables with American settlers who had purchased land grants from families forced to sell under pressure from changing laws and economic circumstances. Cattle buyers from Kansas sat beside mine owners whose silver had funded much of the territory's infrastructure development. The feast itself showcased the global trading networks that had developed to support frontier society. Spices from Mexico, mixed with herbs cultivated in territorial gardens. Wine from California accompanied whiskey distilled in Kentucky and rum that had originated in Caribbean sugar plantations. The complexity of the meal demonstrated not just wealth but also the sophisticated supply chains that connected this remote territory to markets and producers throughout North America and beyond. But beneath the celebration lay tensions that threatened the stability of the entire territorial society. Competition for water rights had led to conflicts that sometimes erupted into violence between ranchers, farmers, and mining operations. Disputes over land ownership continued to simmer as Mexican families challenged American legal interpretations of traditional land grants. Apache resistance remained a constant threat that required military resources and diplomatic negotiations that could collapse at any moment. The consolidation of power represented by the Valcrest-Corvain alliance would fundamentally alter these dynamics. The combined resources of the two families would give them unprecedented influence over territorial politics, water rights, and economic development. Smaller ranchers would be forced to accept subordinate positions or face economic and potentially physical pressure to sell their holdings. The political balance that had maintained an uneasy peace between different ethnic and cultural groups could be disrupted by the concentration of power in the hands of a single extended family network. Samuel understood these implications better than most of the guests who were celebrating the marriage. His position as a house servant had given him access to private conversations, business negotiations, and strategic planning sessions that revealed the true scope of the family's ambitions. He had listened to discussions about eliminating competition, controlling water access, and using political influence to reshape territorial law in ways that would benefit the ranching elite at the expense of smaller operators and marginalized communities. The great hall where the celebration was taking place had itself been constructed as a symbol of this emerging power structure. The building combined local materials with imported luxury goods in ways that demonstrated both connection to the land and access to global markets. The architecture reflected Mexican influences while incorporating American design elements, creating a visual representation of the cultural synthesis that characterized successful territorial society. As Samuel moved through this scene of celebration and power, he carried with him the knowledge that the systems and relationships being celebrated tonight had been built on foundations of violence, exploitation, and systematic oppression that extended far beyond his own personal suffering. The justice he was about to deliver would resonate far beyond the walls of Copperfield Ranch, sending ripples through the carefully constructed networks of power that govern territorial society. Samuel moved through the lamplit halls of Copperfield Ranch with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to make himself indispensable while remaining invisible. For 15 years he had perfected the art of anticipating needs before they were spoken, of appearing at precisely the right moment with exactly the required service, of managing the complex domestic operations that allowed the Valcrest family to project wealth and sophistication in the harsh Arizona territory. Tonight those same skills would serve a different purpose entirely. His weathered hands, scarred from years of kitchen work and marked by the peculiar burns that came from tending fires in desert heat, carried silver serving pieces that reflected the lamplight like captured starfire. Samuel had learned to read the weight and balance of every piece of the family's imported dinnerware, could judge the precise temperature of soup by the steam rising from a tureen, and knew instinctively how much wine to pour for each guest based on their preferences and capacity for alcohol. These were skills that had taken years to develop, abilities that made him valuable enough to avoid the brutal field labor that consumed the lives of other enslaved workers on the ranch. But Samuel's true value lay in his mind rather than his hands. He spoke Spanish with the fluency of someone who had learned it through daily necessity, could negotiate with Apache traders in their own language, and had mastered enough English to follow complex business discussions and legal proceedings. His literacy, acquired through careful observation and patient self-instruction, allowed him to understand documents, contracts, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of the Valcrest family's operations and ambitions. The knowledge he had accumulated over 15 years of service created a detailed map of vulnerabilities, secrets, and connections that extended far beyond the ranch itself. Samuel knew which territorial officials received regular payments from Theric Valcrest, which Mexican landowners had been pressured into selling their property below market value, and which Apache leaders had negotiated private agreements that betrayed their own people's interests. He understood the financial mechanisms that allowed the family to manipulate cattle prices, The legal strategies they used to challenge competitors, land claims, and the network of violence that enforced their will when economic pressure proved insufficient. His position as head house servant had provided access to private conversations that revealed the true nature of the family's character and methods. Samuel had served meals during which the Valcrest men discussed plans to eliminate competition through strategic violence, had cleaned bloodstains from clothing worn during raids on smaller ranchers, and had witnessed celebrations that followed the successful intimidation of families who had refused to sell their land claims. The public face of prosperity and civilization that the family presented to territorial society masked a reality of systematic cruelty that extended far beyond their treatment of enslaved workers. Samuel's own arrival at Copperfield Ranch had followed a pattern that characterized much of frontier slavery. He had been born in Arkansas to parents who had been separated and sold when he was barely old enough to work. His early years had been spent in the cotton fields of East Texas, where he had learned the harsh lessons that governed enslaved life. The importance of invisibility, the necessity of anticipating danger, and the survival value of making himself useful to owners who viewed him as nothing more than valuable property. The journey to Arizona Territory had come when Therick Valcrest decided that his expanding ranch operations required more sophisticated domestic management than the Mexican and Apache workers could provide. Samuel had been purchased specifically for his demonstrated ability to manage complex household operations, his literacy, and his capacity for learning the multiple languages necessary for effective communication in the territory's multicultural environment. But the move to the frontier had also provided opportunities that would have been impossible in the more established slave societies of the Deep South. The isolation of ranch life meant that Samuel often operated with minimal supervision, managing everything from food procurement to staff coordination, with a degree of autonomy that would have been unthinkable on a cotton plantation. The territory's complex ethnic and cultural dynamics created situations where his language skills and cultural knowledge made him an essential intermediary between the family and the broader community. This autonomy had allowed Samuel to develop relationships and acquire knowledge that extended far beyond his official duties. He had formed connections with Mexican workers who shared information about the political and economic changes affecting the territory. He had established trust with Apache suppliers who provided game meat and medicinal plants in exchange for manufactured goods and protection from military raids. He had cultivated friendships with other enslaved workers whose masters' operations intersected with the Valcrest business interests. These relationships had created an informal intelligence network that kept Samuel informed about developments throughout the territory. He knew about failed crops that would affect food prices, about Apache movements that might threaten trading routes, and about political decisions being made in territorial capitals that would impact local business operations. This knowledge made him even more valuable to the family, but it also provided him with the information necessary to understand the broader implications of their actions and the vulnerabilities in their carefully constructed empire. The physical demands of frontier life had shaped Samuel's body into something harder and more resilient than the typical house servant. Ranch operations required workers who could handle multiple responsibilities, from managing livestock to repairing equipment, to dealing with the constant threats posed by weather, wildlife, and human enemies. Samuel had learned to shoot accurately, to track animals and humans across difficult terrain, and to survive in desert conditions that killed men who lacked the necessary knowledge and experience. But perhaps most importantly, Samuel had learned to observe and remember everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts or plans. His face had become a carefully maintained mask that reflected only the emotions appropriate to his role as a servant. He had mastered the art of listening to conversations without appearing to pay attention, of being present during crucial discussions while seeming to focus entirely on his assigned tasks. The family had grown so accustomed to his presence that they often spoke freely in front of him, treating him as a piece of furniture that could hear, but not understand or remember. This invisibility had been both a survival strategy and a source of accumulated fury that had built within Samuel over 15 years of witnessing injustices that he was powerless to prevent or punish. He had watched the family destroy Mexican families who had lived on their traditional lands for generations. He had seen them orchestrate violence against Apache peoples who had attempted to maintain their traditional hunting and gathering practices. He had witnessed the systematic brutalization of workers whose only crime was their vulnerability to the power that the family wielded without restraint or accountability. The decision to take action had not come suddenly or from emotional impulse. Instead, it had grown from years of careful observation, patient planning, and accumulated knowledge about the family's operations, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Samuel understood that any action he took would likely result in his own death, but he had also come to understand that some injustices demanded a response regardless of the personal cost. The wedding celebration provided the perfect opportunity because it would bring together all the key figures in the territorial power structure in a single location, under circumstances where security would be focused on external threats rather than internal dangers. The complexity of the feast preparation would provide cover for the introduction of additional ingredients, and the celebratory atmosphere would delay recognition of symptoms until it was too late for effective medical intervention. As Samuel continued his careful service throughout the Great Hall, he carried within him not just the knowledge and skills necessary to execute his plan, but also the moral certainty that justice sometimes required actions that legal systems were unwilling or unable to take. Tonight, the invisibility that had protected him would become a weapon, and the trust that the family had placed in his competence would become the instrument of their destruction. The candlelight played across the faces of three men whose deaths would transform the power structure of the entire Arizona territory, though none of them suspected that their final evening had arrived with the sunset. Seated at the head table in positions that reflected their status as the territory's emerging elite, they represented different aspects of the systematic violence and exploitation that had built the frontier's most successful ranching empire. Samuel had served each of them for years, had witnessed their cruelties both casual and calculated, and had memorized their habits with the precision of a man who understood that knowledge would eventually become a weapon. Arendor Velocrate dominated the center of the table with the unconscious arrogance of a man who had never doubted his right to take whatever he desired. At 28, he possessed the kind of frontier handsomeness that combined physical strength with political cunning, his weathered features and powerful build testament to years spent in the saddle enforcing his family's will across hundreds of thousands of acres. But Samuel knew the violence that lived behind that confident smile, had witnessed the casual brutality that Arendor deployed against anyone who challenged his authority, or simply failed to show sufficient deference to his status. The young master's cruelties extended far beyond the systematic exploitation that characterized frontier labor relations. Samuel had cleaned blood from Arendor's clothes after raids on Mexican families who had refused to sell their land grants at below-market prices. He had witnessed beatings that left workers permanently disabled for infractions as minor as speaking Spanish within earshot of the main house. Most disturbing had been the night raids on Apache camps, where Arendor had participated in massacres that violated every treaty and agreement that supposedly governed relations between territorial authorities and indigenous peoples. But Arendor's most systematic cruelties had been directed at the women who worked the ranch operations. Samuel had watched him select targets among the Mexican workers, the Apache suppliers, and the enslaved house staff, with the calculating eye of a predator who understood that his position protected him from any consequences for his actions. The pregnancies that resulted from these assaults were handled with cold efficiency. Mixed-race infants were sold to distant buyers, while their mothers were transferred to remote work sites, where their testimony about Arendor's behavior could not reach territorial authorities or business partners. To Arendor's right sat his younger brother Jonas, whose 24 years had been spent learning to follow his elder brother's example while developing his own variations on the family's methods of maintaining control. Where Arendor preferred direct violence, Jonas had mastered the art of economic intimidation, using the family's financial resources to destroy competitors through manipulation of credit, supply chains, and political connections. Samuel had served at meetings where Jonas had outlined plans to bankrupt smaller ranchers by controlling their access to markets, water rights, and essential supplies. Jonas's particular genius lay in understanding how territorial law could be manipulated to provide legal justification for what amounted to theft on a massive scale. He had studied the complex interactions between Mexican land grants, American territorial law, and federal regulations governing Western expansion. This knowledge allowed him to identify vulnerabilities in competitors, legal claims, and exploit technical violations to challenge property ownership through territorial courts that were staffed by judges who depended on Vallecrest family support for their positions. The younger brother's cruelties were more systematic than Arendor's, but no less devastating in their impact. Samuel had witnessed Jonas orchestrate the destruction of Mexican families who had maintained successful farming operations for generations, using legal technicalities to seize property that was then incorporated into Valcrest Holdings. He had seen him manipulate territorial authorities to deny water rights to Apache peoples, forcing them into starvation and dependency that made them vulnerable to exploitation as workers or elimination as competitors for land use. But Jonas's most calculated cruelty had been his systematic campaign against smaller American ranchers who might eventually challenge Valcrest's dominance. Samuel had served meals during which Jonas outlined plans to eliminate competition through coordinated economic pressure, legal challenges, and strategic violence that would drive independent operators out of the territory, while maintaining the family's reputation for legitimate business practices. The goal was nothing less than complete control over the territory's cattle industry, achieved through methods that combined legal manipulation with carefully orchestrated intimidation. The third figure at the head table represented the political dimensions of the family's power. Calvin Drovich served as the Valcrest family's primary connection to territorial government, a relationship that had been cultivated through years of strategic payments, political favors, and shared participation in the economic exploitation that characterized frontier development. At 35, Drovich possessed the smooth mannerisms of a professional politician combined with the calculated amorality of a man who understood that territorial law existed primarily to serve the interests of those wealthy enough to influence its interpretation and enforcement. Drovich's role in the family's operations went far beyond simple political lobbying or influence peddling. Samuel had witnessed him participate directly in planning sessions where military actions against Apache peoples were coordinated with territorial authorities, ensuring that official raids would eliminate specific leaders or communities that posed threats to Valcrest expansion plans. He had seen him manipulate territorial courts to ensure that legal challenges to the family's land claims would be dismissed or delayed until opposition could be eliminated through other means. The politician's most systematic contribution to the family's power had been his ability to ensure that territorial law enforcement would not interfere with their methods of maintaining control. Samuel had served at meetings where Drovich outlined strategies for controlling sheriff appointments, manipulating territorial regulations, and ensuring that federal oversight would not extend to activities that might be technically illegal but serve the broader interests of territorial development and American expansion. But perhaps most disturbing had been Drovich's role in legitimizing the violence that enforced the family's will. Samuel had witnessed him draft official reports that justified massacres as defensive actions, manipulate testimony to frame victims as aggressors, and coordinate with military commanders to ensure that territorial authorities would support rather than investigate the elimination of competitors and resistors. The goal was to create a legal framework that would allow unlimited exploitation while maintaining the fiction of civilized law and order. The three men represented different aspects of a systematic campaign to consolidate control over the territory's resources, political institutions, and economic opportunities. Their individual cruelties were not random acts of violence but coordinated elements of a broader strategy designed to eliminate any challenge to their dominance while expanding their control over land, water, labor, and political power. The wedding celebration was intended to mark the completion of this process, the final consolidation of territorial power under family control. Samuel understood that each of these men had earned their fate through years of systematic cruelty that had destroyed countless lives and corrupted every institution that might have provided justice or protection for their victims. The territorial legal system had been manipulated to serve their interests. Military authorities had been co-opted to provide enforcement for their expansion plans. Economic networks had been controlled to eliminate competition and maintain dependency among workers and smaller operators. But Samuel also understood that their deaths would accomplish more than simple revenge for past cruelties. The elimination of these three men would disrupt the carefully constructed networks of power and influence that maintained the family's control over territorial society. Political alliances would collapse without Drovich's coordination. Economic strategies would fail without Jonas's legal manipulations. Military enforcement would become more difficult without Arendor's direct participation in planning and coordination. The wedding feast provided the perfect opportunity because it would eliminate all three targets simultaneously, before any of them could implement succession plans or transfer their knowledge and relationships to other family members. The symbolic importance of the wedding celebration would ensure that their deaths would be remembered throughout the territory, serving as both warning and inspiration for others who might be considering resistance to the systematic exploitation that characterized frontier development. As Samuel continued his careful service, ensuring that each of the three men received generous portions of the wedding stew that would carry their doom, he felt no satisfaction or anticipation, only the quiet certainty that justice was finally being served after 15 years of patient observation and careful planning. Tonight, the men who had built their power on the suffering of others would finally face the consequences of their choices, and the territory would have an opportunity to develop along different lines that might provide greater justice and opportunity for those who had been systematically excluded from the benefits of frontier success. The scars on Samuel's back told a story that stretched across 15 years of systematic brutality, each mark a testament to lessons learned about the true nature of power in the Arizona Territory. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the deeper injuries that had been inflicted on his sense of justice, dignity, and hope for any life, beyond the careful service that had become both his protection and his prison. The decision to poison the wedding feast had not emerged from a moment of rage or desperation, but from the slow accumulation of witnessed atrocities that had finally convinced him that some forms of evil could only be answered with decisive action. Samuel's earliest memories of the Valcrest family's cruelties dated to his first weeks at Copperfield Ranch, when he had still believed that competent service and respectful behavior might earn him a measure of security within the brutal hierarchy that governed frontier slavery. The reality had been revealed during his first encounter with Arendor's casual violence, a beating administered not for any specific infraction but simply to establish the relationship that would define their interactions for the next decade and a half. The young master had explained, between blows delivered with a leather riding crop, that Samuel's previous experiences with slavery had not adequately prepared him for the realities of frontier life. The lesson had been thorough and precise. Samuel's value as property depended entirely on his usefulness to the family's operations, and that usefulness could be terminated at any moment if his behavior suggested that he had forgotten his place in the territorial hierarchy. The beating had left him unable to work for 3 days, during which he had been denied food and medical attention, while being forced to watch other workers receive similar education in the expectations that governed their lives under Valcrest control. But the physical violence had been only the beginning of Samuel's education in the systematic nature of the family's cruelty. Over the following months, he had been forced to witness the destruction of a Mexican family who had refused to sell their water rights to Theric Valcrest. The father had been murdered during a staged dispute over cattle theft. The mother and daughters had been sold to buyers in California, and the sons had been conscripted into military service that would likely result in their deaths fighting Apache resistance in remote mountain regions. Samuel had been required to serve meals during the planning sessions for this elimination, had been present when the family had celebrated their successful acquisition of the water rights, and had been forced to clean the bloodstains from Arendor's clothing after his participation in the murder that had made the acquisition possible. The message had been clear. Samuel's position provided him with intimate knowledge of the family's methods, but that knowledge also made him complicit in their crimes and vulnerable to elimination if he ever showed signs of disloyalty or resistance. The pattern had been repeated dozens of times over the following years, each incident adding to Samuel's understanding of the systematic nature of the family's operations and the complete absence of any legal or moral constraints on their behavior. He had witnessed the massacre of an Apache band that had been attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution to disputes over hunting rights. He had served at meetings where territorial officials had coordinated military raids designed to eliminate specific indigenous leaders who had been organizing resistance to American expansion. He had cleaned weapons and equipment used in attacks on smaller ranchers who had refused to accept subordinate positions within the Valcrest business empire. But perhaps the most devastating revelations had concerned the family's treatment of women, both enslaved and free, who found themselves vulnerable to their power. Samuel had been forced to witness systematic sexual violence that the family treated as both entertainment and a demonstration of their dominance over every aspect of life within their sphere of influence. Mexican workers, Apache suppliers, and enslaved house staff were all considered available for the family's pleasure, and resistance was met with violence that often resulted in permanent injury or death. The pregnancies that resulted from these assaults were handled with the same cold efficiency that characterized all aspects of the family's operations. Mixed-race infants were sold to distant buyers who specialized in such transactions, ensuring that evidence of the family's behavior would not remain visible within the territory. The mothers were typically transferred to remote work sites or sold to buyers who had been informed that they were potentially troublesome and required careful supervision. Samuel had been forced to participate in these transactions, accompanying family members to meetings with buyers, managing the logistics of transfers, and maintaining the household records that documented the family's human property. The work had required him to develop detailed knowledge of the regional slave trade, the legal mechanisms that governed human property transfers, and the network of buyers and sellers who facilitated the movement of enslaved people throughout the southwestern territories. This knowledge had provided Samuel with a comprehensive understanding of the economic systems that sustained frontier slavery and the political connections that protected those systems from federal oversight or legal challenge. He had learned about the coordination between territorial authorities, military commanders, and business leaders that ensured the continuation of practices that were nominally illegal under federal law, but essential to the economic development that drove American expansion into the region. The realization that had finally driven Samuel to plan his action had come during a conversation between Arendor and Jonas about their long-term strategy for controlling territorial development. The brothers had been discussing plans to eliminate not just individual competitors but entire communities that might pose future challenges to their dominance. Their vision extended beyond simple economic control to a complete transformation of territorial society that would create permanent hierarchies based on race, class, and political loyalty. The conversation had revealed that the family's cruelties were not random acts of violence or exploitation, but systematic elements of a broader campaign to create a territorial society that would serve their interests in perpetuity. They planned to manipulate statehood proceedings to ensure that territorial law would permanently enshrine their advantages. They intended to control educational institutions to prevent the development of local leadership that might challenge their authority. They envisioned a future where their descendants would rule the territory as a hereditary aristocracy, protected by legal structures that would make resistance impossible and opposition illegal. Samuel had realized that the family's ambitions extended far beyond their current victims to encompass future generations who would be born into a system designed to prevent any possibility of justice, equality, or individual advancement for those deemed inferior by the ruling elite. The wedding celebration represented the final step in implementing this vision, the consolidation of power that would make their control over territorial society complete and irreversible. The decision to act had been accompanied by the understanding that his own survival was almost certainly impossible. Territorial authorities would conduct a thorough investigation of any incident that resulted in the deaths of such prominent figures. The family's political connections would ensure that pressure for justice would be intense and persistent. Samuel's position as head house servant would make him an obvious suspect, and his knowledge of the family's operations would make him too dangerous to be allowed to survive, regardless of whether his guilt could be proven. But Samuel had also understood that some moral imperatives transcended individual survival. The systematic nature of the family's cruelties, the scope of their future ambitions, and the complete absence of any legal or political mechanisms for restraining their power had convinced him that direct action was the only remaining option for preventing the implementation of their vision for territorial society. The months of preparation had involved not just the acquisition of knowledge about poisons and their effects, but careful consideration of the broader implications of his planned action. Samuel had used his intelligence network among Mexican workers, Apache suppliers, and other enslaved people to understand how the family's elimination would affect the broader territorial community. He had concluded that while their deaths would certainly create instability and possibly violence, the long-term consequences of allowing their plans to proceed would be far more devastating for everyone who lived under their control. As Samuel made his final preparations for the wedding feast, he carried with him not just the accumulated fury of 15 years of systematic oppression, but also the moral certainty that some forms of evil required decisive response, regardless of the personal costs involved. Tonight, the men who had built their power on the systematic brutalization of others would finally face justice, and the territory would have an opportunity to develop along different lines that might provide greater freedom and opportunity for those who had been excluded from the benefits of frontier prosperity. The knowledge that would make Samuel's justice possible had come from an unlikely source: Vizira Halcourt, an elderly Apache medicine woman who had been forced to work at Copperfield Ranch after her band was massacred during one of Arendor's raids 3 years earlier. Vizira possessed centuries of accumulated wisdom about the desert's deadly plants, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of healers who understood that the same landscape that could sustain life could also end it with equal efficiency. Samuel had earned her trust through small acts of kindness and protection, sharing his meager rations when she was denied food as punishment for refusing to abandon her traditional religious practices. The education had begun slowly, disguised as conversations about medicinal plants that might help treat the various ailments that plagued ranch workers who lacked access to territorial doctors. Vizira had taught Samuel to identify dozens of desert plants by their appearance, scent, and seasonal variations. She had explained which parts of each plant contained active compounds, how those compounds affected the human body, and what dosages would produce effects ranging from mild discomfort to swift death. The lessons had been framed as practical knowledge for someone responsible for managing household health and food preparation, but both teacher and student understood the broader implications of the information being shared. The specific poison that Samuel had chosen for the wedding feast came from a combination of 3 plants that grew in different regions of the territory, requiring months of careful collection and preparation to acquire sufficient quantities for his purposes. The primary component was derived from the seeds of a desert shrub that produced compounds similar to those found in castor beans, but with effects that were both more predictable and more difficult to detect in food. The second element came from a flowering plant that grew in the mountain regions where Apache bands had traditionally gathered medicinal herbs, contributing alkaloids that would accelerate the absorption of the primary toxin while producing symptoms that mimicked common food poisoning. The third and most crucial component was extracted from a fungus that grew only during specific weather conditions on decaying wood in streambeds that had been contaminated by mining operations upstream. This fungus produced compounds that would delay the onset of symptoms while ensuring that the eventual effects would be both severe and irreversible. The combination created a poison that would allow the wedding feast to conclude normally while ensuring that the consequences would manifest within hours of consumption, too late for effective medical intervention but early enough to prevent the targets from leaving the ranch. The preparation process had required Samuel to develop skills that went far beyond traditional cooking or food preservation. He had learned to extract and concentrate active compounds using techniques that combined Apache traditional knowledge with improvised laboratory methods developed through careful experimentation. The process involved carefully controlled heating, precise timing, and chemical reactions that required materials acquired through the ranch's normal supply chains without arousing suspicion about their intended use. Samuel had tested his preparations extensively using small animals that could be captured without notice around the ranch operations. The experiments had allowed him to refine dosages, understand timing variations based on body weight and individual metabolism, and identify potential complications that might interfere with the poison's effectiveness. The testing had been conducted with the same methodical precision that Samuel applied to all aspects of household management, ensuring that every variable was understood and controlled before the final application. The delivery method had been chosen specifically to take advantage of the wedding feast's complexity and the social dynamics that would govern the evening's meal service. The wedding stew represented the perfect vehicle because its preparation required multiple stages of cooking, seasoning, and serving that would provide numerous opportunities for introducing additional ingredients without detection. The complexity of flavors in the traditional recipe would mask any unusual tastes or aromas that might otherwise alert guests to the presence of foreign substances. Samuel's position as head house servant provided him with complete control over the final preparation and serving of the stew, ensuring that specific portions could be prepared for targeted individuals while leaving other guests unaffected. The serving protocol that he had established for the wedding feast would position him directly behind the head table during the meal, allowing him to observe the consumption of the poisoned portions, while maintaining the appearance of attentive service that guests expected from ranch staff. The timing of the poison's effects had been calculated to coincide with the conclusion of the evening's formal celebrations, when guests would be retiring to their assigned quarters throughout the ranch complex. The delayed onset would prevent immediate association between the symptoms and the meal, buying precious time before medical attention could be summoned and potentially effective treatments attempted. The symptoms themselves would initially resemble severe food poisoning or alcohol poisoning, conditions that were common enough after large frontier celebrations to avoid immediate suspicion of deliberate poisoning. Samuel had prepared contingency plans for several potential complications that might interfere with his primary strategy. If the targets consumed insufficient quantities of the poisoned stew, he had prepared alternative delivery methods using the wine service and dessert course that would provide additional opportunities for ensuring adequate dosages. If medical assistance arrived more quickly than anticipated, he had identified specific symptoms that would suggest treatments that would actually accelerate rather than counteract the poison's effects. The most challenging aspect of the preparation had been maintaining the psychological composure necessary to carry out such an elaborate deception while continuing to perform his normal duties with the efficiency and reliability that the family expected. Samuel had spent months practicing the emotional control that would allow him to serve the poisoned meal without revealing any signs of anticipation, anxiety, or satisfaction that might alert observant guests to the danger they were consuming. The final preparation had involved the careful integration of the concentrated poison into the stew during the last stages of cooking, when the complexity of flavors would be at its peak and the addition of new ingredients would appear to be normal seasoning adjustments. Samuel had rehearsed the process dozens of times, memorizing the exact timing, movements, and procedures that would allow him to complete the poisoning without detection while maintaining the appearance of routine food preparation. The quantities had been calculated with mathematical precision based on Samuel's observations of each target's typical consumption patterns, body weight, and individual tolerance for alcohol-enriched foods. Arendor typically consumed large portions of any meal that was prepared specially for important occasions, ensuring that he would receive a lethal dose even if he ate more conservatively than usual. Jonas had a tendency to sample multiple servings of dishes that he particularly enjoyed, making it likely that he would consume dangerous quantities, even if the concentration per serving was relatively modest. Calvin Drovic's smaller build and moderate eating habits required a higher concentration in his portion, but his predictable preference for the most expensive and elaborately prepared dishes would ensure that he would focus on the poisoned stew rather than alternative menu items. The psychological preparation had been as important as the chemical and logistical planning. Samuel had spent months mentally rehearsing the evening's events, imagining every possible scenario, and preparing himself for the emotional challenges of watching the poison take effect while maintaining his role as a concerned and helpful servant. The knowledge that he was very likely to be discovered and executed for his actions required him to find peace with his own mortality while maintaining focus on the immediate tasks that would determine whether his sacrifice would achieve its intended purpose. The broader implications of his actions had also required careful consideration. Samuel understood that the elimination of these three men would create opportunities for others to seize control of the family's resources and political connections, and he had used his intelligence network to ensure that information about the family's crimes and methods would be available to territorial authorities and federal investigators who might be able to use it to prevent the emergence of similar concentrations of power in the future. As Samuel made his final adjustments to the wedding stew, adding the last measured doses of concentrated poison to the portions that would be served to his three targets, he felt neither anticipation nor regret, only the quiet satisfaction that came from completing a task that had required months of careful planning, extraordinary patience, and moral courage that few people would have been able to sustain. Tonight, justice would finally be served alongside the evening's feast, and the men who had built their empire on the systematic brutalization of others would discover that even the most carefully constructed systems of power contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge, determination, and willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause of justice. The grandfather clock in the corner of Copperfield's great hall chimed 8 times as Samuel emerged from the kitchen carrying the massive silver tureen that contained the wedding stew, its polished surface reflecting the lamplight like captured moonbeams while concealing the instrument of justice that simmered within. The assembled guests turned their attention toward the ceremonial presentation of the evening's centerpiece, their voices rising in appreciation for what they believed would be a celebration of frontier culinary achievement. None suspected that they were witnessing the final act of a drama that had been 15 years in the making. The wedding stew itself was a masterpiece of frontier cooking that represented the cultural synthesis which characterized successful territorial society. Beef from the ranch's finest cattle had been combined with venison provided by Apache hunters, seasoned with chiles grown in Mexican gardens, and enriched with ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles along trading routes that connected the remote territory to markets throughout North America. The complexity of flavors reflected the intricate web of relationships, negotiations, and accommodations that made frontier life possible, though Samuel understood that beneath this apparent harmony lay the systematic violence and exploitation that actually governed territorial society. Samuel's movements as he positioned the tureen on the serving table were those of a man who had perfected every gesture through years of practice, each action calculated to appear routine while serving purposes that extended far beyond the evening's meal service. His weathered hands showed no tremor as he arranged the silver ladles and serving bowls that would deliver death to 3 men while providing nourishment to dozens of other guests. The careful choreography of service that he had rehearsed for months was finally being performed before an audience that remained completely unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. The great hall itself had been transformed for the wedding celebration into a showcase of frontier prosperity that demonstrated the Valcrest family's ability to create civilization in the harsh Arizona desert. Tables constructed from local pine had been covered with imported linens that had traveled by wagon train from textile mills in Massachusetts. Crystal glasses that had been manufactured in Pennsylvania workshops reflected the light from oil lamps, whose fuel had been transported from refineries along the Gulf Coast. The entire scene represented a triumph of American commerce and organization over the challenges posed by distance, climate, and indigenous resistance. But Samuel moved through this display of frontier achievement with the knowledge that its foundation rested on systematic injustice that extended far beyond the individual cruelties he had witnessed over 15 years of service. The wealth on display had been accumulated through the deliberate destruction of Mexican families, the elimination of Apache peoples, and the exploitation of enslaved workers whose labor made the entire operation possible. The celebration of marriage and prosperity was simultaneously a commemoration of conquest and dispossession that had transformed the territorial landscape according to the interests of men who measured success by their ability to impose their will on everyone around them. Arendor Valcrest commanded attention from his position at the head table, his confident bearing and expensive clothing marking him as the undisputed center of the evening's festivities. The bridegroom had spared no expense in creating a celebration that would demonstrate his family's wealth and influence to the assembled representatives of territorial society. His toast to the future had been received with enthusiastic applause from guests who understood that their own prosperity depended on maintaining favorable relationships with the emerging cattle baron dynasty. Samuel approached Arendor's place setting with the measured pace that characterized all his interactions with the family, his expression maintaining the careful neutrality that had protected him through years of service, while concealing thoughts that would have resulted in immediate execution if they had ever been revealed. The first portion of poisoned stew was ladled into Arendor's bowl with the same precision that Samuel applied to every aspect of his duties, ensuring that the young master received exactly the quantity necessary to guarantee the effects that would manifest within hours of consumption. The conversation at the head table continued without interruption as Samuel served the deadly meal, the 3 targets discussing business plans and political strategies that would never be implemented while consuming the instrument of their destruction with obvious pleasure. Arendor praised the complexity of flavors in the stew, commenting on the skillful combination of ingredients that demonstrated the sophistication of frontier cuisine. His appreciation for the meal that would kill him provided Samuel with a moment of grim satisfaction, though his expression remained impassive as he continued the serving process. Jonas Valcrest occupied the seat to his brother's right, his attention focused on a conversation with territorial officials about legal strategies for challenging Mexican land grants that remained outside family control. The younger brother's appetite had always been substantial, and he consumed his portion of the poisoned stew with the enthusiasm of a man who had never doubted his right to enjoy the finest things that frontier life could provide. Samuel ensured that Jonas received a particularly generous serving, calculating that the young man's predictable gluttony would guarantee consumption of a lethal dose, even if his individual tolerance proved higher than anticipated. The political discussions that dominated the head table conversation revealed the scope of the family's ambitions and the systematic nature of their approach to consolidating territorial control. Jonas outlined legal precedents that could be used to challenge indigenous land claims throughout the region, while Calvin Drovic described political strategies for ensuring that territorial statehood proceedings would favor American settlers at the expense of existing Mexican and Apache communities. The conversation provided Samuel with confirmation that his actions would prevent the implementation of plans that would have devastating consequences for thousands of people who lacked the power to resist the family's expansion. Calvin Drovic represented the political dimension of the conspiracy that Samuel was disrupting through his careful poisoning. The territorial official's position at the head table reflected his crucial role in providing legal legitimacy for actions that would otherwise be recognized as simple theft and murder. Drovic's consumption of the poisoned stew was accompanied by detailed explanations of how territorial law could be manipulated to provide retroactive justification for violence against indigenous peoples and Mexican landowners who refused to accept American authority. Samuel's service of the deadly meal to Drovic required particular care because the politician's smaller build and moderate eating habits meant that he was more likely to consume insufficient quantities if the portion size appeared excessive. The solution involved presenting a more modest serving, while ensuring that the concentration of active compounds was higher than in the portions prepared for the Valcrest brothers. The careful calibration required Samuel to make subtle adjustments to the serving process that would not be noticed by other guests, but would guarantee that each target received an individually calculated lethal dose. The broader celebration continued around the deadly drama being enacted at the head table, with guests throughout the Great Hall consuming the same stew recipe that was killing 3 men while experiencing no ill effects themselves. Mexican vaqueros shared tables with American settlers, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns, with the easy familiarity of men who had learned to work together despite their cultural differences. Apache scouts exchanged hunting stories with territorial officials who relied on their knowledge of local geography and wildlife patterns. The complexity of territorial society was reflected in the wedding guest list, which included representatives of every group that had been affected by the Valcrest family's rise to power. Some guests were allies who had benefited from the family's success and political connections. Others were former competitors who had been forced to accept subordinate positions after their own operations had been destroyed through economic pressure or direct violence. Still others were territorial officials whose cooperation had been purchased through systematic bribery and shared participation in the exploitation of vulnerable populations. Samuel understood that many of the guests were themselves victims of the system that the Valcrest family had created and maintained through their systematic cruelty. Smaller ranchers had been forced to accept disadvantageous partnerships that effectively made them employees rather than independent operators. Mexican landowners had been pressured into selling their traditional holdings at below-market prices through legal manipulations and threats of violence. Apache leaders had been coerced into agreements that traded access to traditional hunting grounds for minimal compensation and promises of protection that were rarely honored. The evening's entertainment reflected the cultural diversity that characterized frontier society, while also demonstrating the hierarchies that governed social relationships within that diversity. Mexican musicians provided musical accompaniment that combined traditional forms with American popular songs, creating a synthesis that pleased guests from different cultural backgrounds while reinforcing the dominant position of American settlers within the territorial social structure. The music served as background for conversations that ranged from business negotiations to political planning to social gossip that revealed the complex web of relationships and rivalries that shaped territorial life. As Samuel completed the service of the poisoned stew and began clearing empty bowls from the head table, he observed the early signs that his careful preparations were beginning to take effect. Arendor's face showed the first flush of fever that would precede more serious symptoms, though the young master attributed his discomfort to the effects of alcohol and rich food rather than the poison that was already beginning to attack his digestive system. Jonas complained of mild stomach upset that he dismissed as the result of eating too quickly, unaware that his body was beginning the process of shutting down in response to the toxic compounds he had consumed. Calvin Drovic's reaction was more subtle, but equally indicative of the poison's effectiveness. The politician's typical volubility was giving way to a quieter demeanor that suggested the onset of the neurological effects that would eventually progress to complete incapacitation. His efforts to maintain normal conversation were becoming more labored, though other guests attributed his changed behavior to fatigue rather than the beginning of systematic organ failure. The conclusion of the meal service marked the transition from the formal dining portion of the celebration to the social activities that would occupy the remainder of the evening. Guests began moving from the dining tables to other areas of the Great Hall where entertainment and informal conversation would continue until the early hours of the morning. The movement created opportunities for Samuel to observe his targets more closely while maintaining the appearance of routine household management responsibilities. The wedding cake ceremony provided the final punctuation to the evening's meal service, with Arundor and Morel performing the traditional cutting ritual while guests applauded and offered toasts to their future happiness. The irony of celebrating a future that would never arrive was not lost on Samuel, though he maintained his carefully composed expression while serving cake portions to guests who remained unaware that they were witnessing the final public appearance of the territory's most powerful cattle baron family. As the evening's formal festivities transitioned into more relaxed social activities, Samuel began the process of withdrawing from the Great Hall to attend to the household duties that would provide him with alibis for the crucial hours when the poison's effects would become apparent. The careful timing of his movements was designed to ensure that he would be occupied with routine tasks in other parts of the ranch complex when the first symptoms became severe enough to attract medical attention and prompt the investigation that would determine his own fate. The last image Samuel carried with him as he left the Great Hall was that of three men who had built their power on the systematic brutalization of others, now consuming their final drinks while discussing plans that would never be implemented and celebrating achievements that would not survive the night. Justice had finally been served after 15 years of patient preparation, and the territorial landscape was about to change in ways that none of the evening's guests could possibly anticipate. The first scream pierced the August night at precisely 11:47, shattering the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over Copperfield Ranch as wedding guests retired to their assigned quarters throughout the sprawling complex. Samuel heard it from the kitchen, where he was completing the cleaning duties that provided him with an alibi for the crucial hours when his carefully administered justice would finally manifest its effects. The sound carried across the desert air with the stark clarity that characterized frontier nights, when the absence of competing noise allowed human voices to travel for miles across the empty landscape. Arundor Valcrest's voice, normally commanding and confident, had been reduced to an animal howl of agony that spoke to suffering beyond anything the young cattle baron had ever experienced. The poison was working exactly as Samuel had calculated, attacking the digestive system with methodical precision, while producing symptoms that would initially be attributed to severe food poisoning rather than deliberate murder. The timing allowed the wedding celebration to conclude normally, while ensuring that medical intervention would come too late to prevent the intended consequences. Samuel continued his methodical cleaning of the kitchen equipment, maintaining the routine that had governed his evenings for 15 years, while listening to the sounds that marked the destruction of the power structure that had controlled territorial society. His weathered hands showed no tremor as he scrubbed the serving bowls that had carried death to three men, his expression remaining carefully neutral despite the knowledge that his patient planning was finally achieving its intended results. The second indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came 20 minutes later, when Calvin Drovich's political associates began pounding on doors throughout the guest quarters, their voices sharp with panic as they called for medical assistance. The territorial officials' collapse had been witnessed by several prominent guests who had been discussing statehood proceedings in the ranch's library, when Drovich suddenly doubled over in agony, his face contorting with pain that defied his attempts to maintain political composure. Samuel moved to the main house's medicine cabinet, ostensibly to gather supplies that might help treat what appeared to be severe digestive distress affecting multiple wedding guests. His knowledge of frontier medical practices allowed him to select treatments that would appear helpful while actually accelerating rather than counteracting the poison's effects. The careful selection of inappropriate remedies would contribute to the confusion that would delay effective intervention while maintaining Samuel's appearance as a concerned and helpful household servant. The territorial doctor who served Copperfield Ranch lived 30 miles away in the nearest settlement, a distance that required several hours of hard riding across desert terrain that was dangerous even in daylight. The delay in summoning professional medical assistance had been factored into Samuel's planning, ensuring that the poison would have sufficient time to complete its work before any treatments could be attempted that might reverse or mitigate its effects. But the immediate crisis was being managed by Morel Corvain, whose practical frontier education had included basic medical training that was essential for managing large household operations in remote locations. The new bride had taken charge of the emergency response with the efficiency that characterized successful frontier women, organizing other guests to provide assistance while sending riders to summon whatever medical help could be found in the surrounding region. Morel's medical knowledge was more extensive than Samuel had anticipated, and her quick recognition that the symptoms suggested poisoning rather than simple food contamination created complications that threatened to accelerate the investigation beyond his carefully planned timeline. The bride's urgent questions about food preparation, ingredient sources, and kitchen staff responsibilities forced Samuel to begin implementing contingency strategies that he had hoped would prove unnecessary. The third victim's collapse occurred as Samuel was discussing the evening's meal preparation with Morel and several other guests who had medical experience. Jonas Valcrest's violent convulsions began during this conversation, providing dramatic confirmation that the symptoms were not coincidental but represented a coordinated attack on the three most powerful men in territorial society. The timing created a moment of terrible clarity for everyone present, transforming what had appeared to be tragic misfortune into obvious evidence of deliberate murder. Samuel's response to this revelation required the most demanding performance of his life, expressing shock and horror at the possibility that someone had deliberately poisoned the wedding feast, while maintaining the careful emotional control that would prevent any signs of guilt or satisfaction from revealing his role in the unfolding tragedy. The psychological challenges of this deception were intensified by his awareness that several of the assembled guests possessed the intelligence and observational skills necessary to detect inconsistencies in his behavior. The immediate practical consequences of recognizing that poisoning had occurred included the need to secure all remaining food and drink from the evening's celebration, identify everyone who had access to food preparation areas, and begin the process of questioning kitchen staff and household servants about any unusual activities or suspicious behavior they might have observed. These measures created exactly the kind of intensive scrutiny that Samuel had expected but hoped to delay until the poison had completed its work. Morel's systematic approach to managing the crisis revealed leadership capabilities that had been concealed beneath the social expectations that governed women's public behavior in territorial society. Her rapid transformation from wedding bride to crisis commander demonstrated the practical competence that enabled frontier families to survive in environments where death could result from small mistakes or momentary inattention to potential dangers. The medical examination of the three victims provided additional evidence that confirmed the deliberate nature of their condition while revealing details about the poison's effects that could potentially lead investigators to identify its source and method of preparation. Morel's documentation of symptoms, timing, and progression created a clinical record that would prove invaluable to any territorial authorities who possessed the scientific knowledge necessary to analyze the information systematically. Samuel found himself in the impossible position of being simultaneously the most valuable witness to the evening's events and the person most likely to be suspected of causing them. His intimate knowledge of food preparation procedures made his testimony essential for understanding how the poisoning could have occurred, while his access to all aspects of the meal service made him an obvious suspect for any investigator who understood the logistics required for such a precise and coordinated attack. The arrival of the first territorial officials occurred sooner than Samuel had anticipated, as riders who had been dispatched to summon medical assistance also carried news of the crisis to law enforcement authorities in the nearest settlements. Sheriff Draven Thorsell reached Copperfield Ranch less than 4 hours after the first symptoms appeared, accompanied by a deputy and a territorial marshal whose presence indicated that the incident was already being treated as a serious threat to regional stability. Sheriff Thorsell's reputation for competence and integrity created additional complications for Samuel's situation, as the lawman's systematic approach to investigating territorial crimes had earned him respect throughout the region for his ability to solve complex cases that other officials had abandoned as hopeless. The sheriff's immediate focus on securing evidence and interviewing witnesses suggested that the investigation would be more thorough and sophisticated than Samuel had prepared for. The questioning of household staff began before dawn, with each worker being interviewed separately about their activities during the wedding preparation and their observations of anything unusual or suspicious that might have occurred during the crucial hours when the poison was being introduced into the food supply. Samuel's position as head house servant meant that he would be among the last to be questioned, providing him with opportunities to observe the investigation's progress and adjust his testimony accordingly. The death of Arendor Valcrest occurred at sunrise, marking the successful completion of the first phase of Samuel's plan while creating the political crisis that would determine whether his actions would ultimately achieve their broader objectives. The elimination of the territory's most powerful cattle baron would create opportunities for smaller ranchers and marginalized communities, but it would also trigger a violent response from territorial authorities who depended on the existing power structure for their own positions and privileges. As Samuel prepared for the interrogation that would determine his fate, he carried with him the knowledge that justice had finally been served after 15 years of patient preparation, regardless of whether he would survive to witness the long-term consequences of his actions. The bloodline that had built its power on systematic cruelty had finally begun to end, and the territorial landscape would never again be dominated by the men who had seemed untouchable just hours before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.